Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Camera Lies, Acting for Hitchcock, by Dan Callahan, narrated by George Newbern. For every answer, I like to bring up a question. Maybe I'm related to Alfred Hitchcock, or maybe I got to know him too well, but I think life should be that way. I don't think you want to give up all the answers, but I think every answer you do give should bring up another question. And not all questions should be answered. Kim Novak, 1996, The Washington Post. Introduction. Walt Disney had the right idea. A beaming Alfred Hitchcock told Dick Cavett on TV in 1972. If he didn't like the actors, he tore them up. On that same Cavett program, Hitchcock also went into his well-practiced, lugubrious elaboration on a famous remark he had supposedly made in the late 1920s, and again in the mid-1930s. I think at the time I was accused of calling actors cattle, Hitchcock told Cavett. I would never say such an unfeeling, rude thing about actors at all. What I probably said was that all actors should be treated like cattle. This setup and punchline got its expected laugh from the studio audience. Hitchcock once told director Peter Bogdanovich, "Actors are like children. They have to be coddled and sometimes spanked." On the set of Hitchcock's romantic comedy Mr. and Mrs. Smith, 1941, his friend Carole Lombard rented some cattle and had her name and the names of her co-stars, Robert Montgomery and Gene Raymond, tied on name tags around their necks. Hitchcock very much enjoyed this gag, just as he enjoyed Lombard's sense of fun and her very profane language, the free use of which was not usual for women in that period. Lombard is an ideal Hitchcock blonde to tickle his personal fancy, or a blonde Hitchcock ideal, someone who didn't need to be menaced out of ladylike reserve. An exuberant Lombard was a liberated American woman, peppy and inventive enough to make a joke without wondering if it might backfire. And Hitchcock allows her to rule his frames just as he allowed the similarly free-spirited Tallulah Bankhead to rule Lifeboat, 1944. Bankhead, too, was an American, a Southern belle, so liberated that her basso-voiced kicking over the traces became a camp joke. She had made exciting appearances on the London stage all through the 1920s, when Hitchcock was serving his apprenticeship in the British film industry, and he always saw her as an example of what a woman could be. Bankhead was a mile-a-minute talker and an exhibitionist who liked to take all her clothes off as often as possible. To Hitchcock, she was great fun, just as Lombard was, because she was so different from most of the women he had grown up with in his native England. She is mentioned by name, lovingly, as just Tallulah in Hitchcock's Murder, 1930, which is set in the theater world. The patrician Grace Kelly, an American yet nearly British in her Philadelphia finishing school way, has come to be seen as the ultimate Hitchcock blonde on screen and in life. The one that got away, the ideal of ideals, the lady with a dirty mind of her own. It was no mistake that she really won Hitchcock's heart when she responded with pleasure to his habitual dirty talk. "I said I heard worse things when I was in convent school, and he loved that," Kelly said. Imagine Hitchcock's own pleasure when Kelly came out with that line in such a special and lightly blasphemous way. Could Kelly have sensed that it was exactly what Hitchcock wanted to hear, in exactly that way? Lutheran-raised Tippi Hedren, who starred in The Birds, 1963, and Marnie, 1964, for Hitchcock, did not respond to his hushed ribaldry, his dirty mind, or his schoolboy jokes. Hitchcock had put Hedren under personal contract, and he became obsessed by her. Famed for his self-possession and his orderliness on sets and in his life, Hitchcock was in his early 60s when he was making Marnie, and he had reached a breaking point. Hitchcock told many people that he had only experienced sexual intercourse once in his life, with his wife Alma, when they wanted a child in 1927. "I did it with a fountain pen," Hitchcock quipped to Donald Spoto and several others. He had been raised in the most repressive possible Edwardian atmosphere, and had been taught by Jesuit priests. He had always used food as reassurance, and his weight both protected him and closed him off. Hitchcock vacillated between feeling superior to others when it came to sex and longing for it himself. and on his sets he constantly told naughty stories that had the ring of the schoolyard about them. They were the heavy-handed, inexact stories and jokes of an inexperienced boy who became an old man without ever having had the kind of sexual play and knowledge that many boys have enjoyed before the age of 20. And so in his early 60s, this lifelong pressure finally became too much for Hitchcock to handle, and he behaved very badly. Hitchcock pitted Hedren and Diane Baker against each other on the Marnie set, at least partly because they were enemies in the movie, and because Baker's character is a romantic rival of Hedren's character. Elia Kazan was noted and even celebrated for this kind of psychological manipulation on his sets. But of course, there is a gender bias at work here, or a bias of desire. When Hitchcock is faced with wooden playing by John Gavin, his second male lead in Psycho, 1960, he simply abandons both actor and character, but not before making his contempt for both of them clear. Gavin is a performer who is roughly the male equivalent of Hedren and Baker in fine looks but iffy talent, and Hitchcock had no time for him. But Hitchcock often identified with both his male and female characters, and this is part of what makes him such a major artist and still worth writing more about. When I shoot a terrifying scene of Psycho or The Birds, I don't go home to have nightmares all night long, Hitchcock told François Truffaut. It's simply another day's work. I've done my best, and that's all there is to it. In fact, although I'm very serious during the shooting, I might even feel like laughing about those things afterward. And that's something that bothers me because, at the same time, I can't help imagining how it would feel to be in the victim's place. Hitchcock seeks to emotionally involve his audience and make them identify with all sorts of people. And he wants the audience to emote, not the actors. This is why if you are really involved in watching a Hitchcock film, you can accept anything that happens in them. It is only when you are detached that they might seem far-fetched or implausible. Hitchcock can put you in the place of a serenely dedicated Nazi, but he also makes you see how identity is so unstable and people are so suggestible that they can go against their own best instincts and principles, or be contaminated by contact with evil in others. He seems to believe, finally, in a sort of spiritual possession, and in people as vessels with empty spaces that can be filled by anything, by grace on one end or by evil on the other. And who are we as humans to be able to tell the difference? Yet, of course, we try to tell that difference and to judge people in a movie or people in front of a camera. The standard line is that you can hide nothing from the camera. John Barrymore once said, if you stay in front of the movie camera long enough, it will show you not only what you had for breakfast, but who your ancestors were. But this Barrymore idea of what the camera can see is maybe a bit old-fashioned. The French actress Isabelle Huppert has said that acting to her is wanting to be looked at without being seen. There is a vast distance between someone like Barrymore, a matinee idol on stage and a famously romantic player of Hamlet, and Huppert, who unselfconsciously offers herself up to the camera but remains nearly wholly enigmatic. Most of Huppert's notable characters have no moral or ethical boundaries, and the evil that may lurk in an Huppert character cannot be anticipated. Surely Hitchcock would have relished her perverse Ground Zero work in something like, say, The Piano Teacher, 2001, for he was an acting postmodernist in this respect before his time. George Cukor might love and caress and bring out someone like Barrymore in A Bill of Divorcement, 1932, and Dinner at 8, 1933. And Barrymore's florid work still has its romantic charge in pictures like that, but Hitchcock distrusts open displays of emotion. He liked what he called negative acting, as in a moment where a smile falls away from a face, which is most touchingly done by Sylvia Sidney in the movie house sequence in Sabotage in 1936, where she watches a Disney cartoon. The camera lies, Hitchcock would say to his actors. Not always, but sometimes. And he knew when he needed the camera to tell as much of the truth as possible. When Hitchcock was tasked in early 1945 with editing together footage of the liberated Nazi concentration camps for a documentary, he instructed the cameramen to film as much as possible with long tracking shots, which cannot be tampered with, according to his editor Peter Tantor. The camera could show the passage of time or human thought. and it could make a person look like something they weren't, or like they were thinking or feeling something they weren't, depending on how different shots were juxtaposed. What Hitchcock really liked were faces in some kind of transition. He liked that split-second gulf between one emotion and another and what it might reveal to his camera. Ingrid Bergman was maybe the ultimate female Hitchcock actor because she could dwell in that in-between state longer than anybody else, and her face was always alive with exciting contrasts and counterpoints of emotion. What Hitchcock could do with his camera and his montage sequences, Bergman could do with her face. When she is not smiling, Bergman's face lives in dreamy uncertainty, and that's what hope can be, and carefully hidden and protected hope is what Hitchcock is all about. He often spoke about being afraid as a boy, and he made that part of his image. Hitchcock's creativity is based on fear and wanting us to be afraid with him, and fear contains an element of hope. Fear has within it the desire for the worst, which could possibly lead to change for the best, and Hitchcock wanted to live in that possibility. What is the dizziness of vertigo, after all, but the desire to fall? You can fall in love, or you can fall to your death. I've always wanted to be someone else, Hitchcock says in the introduction to an episode of his TV show called None Are So Blind, and he sounds like he means it. That's what acting can be, and that's what hope can be. Cary Grant was probably the ultimate male Hitchcock actor because he was edgy and never complacent, and he behaved like a moving target. And so Grant was an unsettled dream come true, and a dream coming true is what Hitchcock wanted to allow room for. Hitchcock sometimes acted scenes out for his actors, and he wanted a certain tempo in the delivery of lines down to the second. He was often so sure of when he wanted to cut while an actor talked that he knew which syllable of a word he would be cutting on. Walter Slezak was very impressed when Hitchcock gave the stymied Mary Anderson some purely technical direction during a difficult scene in Lifeboat, telling her to lower her voice and let her breath give out before a certain line. Hitch knows more about the mechanics and the physical technique of acting than any man I know, Slezak said. Hitchcock developed his own movie-making technique, but he remained open to chance and dreams in his own writing sessions as he worked on his scripts with his wife Alma, and whatever writer was then at hand. He liked to stealthily talk and gossip with his writers until a solution to a script problem would somehow naturally arise, for he knew that if you press hard for anything, it isn't likely to come, or if it does come, it won't be very good. It is very easy to get details wrong when writing about Hitchcock films because they move like magic acts, and they always have an element of sleight of hand. Hitchcock was generally unconcerned with plausibility, or what he called the plausibles, out in the audience, the people who would nitpick and say later that something in the narrative didn't ring true. He called this sort of childlike questioning moronic logic, but he was also nervous about lack of plausibility sometimes, and this was an area where he expected and needed Alma to sometimes pull him back at the scenario stage and get his feet on the ground. Hitchcock was basically unmoved by truth or facts, finding them too often dull and not particularly believable in the supercharged, often surreal, dreamlike sense he favored as his truth. In one of the most acute sections of his long interview with François Truffaut, Hitchcock states that if an artist actually observes or experiences something unusual or seemingly implausible in their own life, that they should not put it in their film or play or novel, and then cry, "But it actually happened to me," or "It actually happened to someone I know," for that is never a good enough creative reason. Hitchcock deals in dreams, fears, and archetypes, but the richness of his work lies in his ability to also charge these non-realistic elements with realistic detail. The Hitchcock actors had to stay within the frames and compositions he had in mind, but within these frames, they were often free to do as they liked, as long as he felt that they were well cast and serious about their work. He made his actors are cattle statement because the English actors he was working with in the 1930s, like John Gielgud, who starred in Secret Agent, 1936, and Michael Redgrave, who was the lead in The Lady Vanishes, 1938, treated movie work too lightly. I do not know whether his famous actors or cattle remark was coined for my benefit, but I well remember his saying it in my presence, Redgrave said. Gielgud was starring on stage in Romeo and Juliet with Peggy Ashcroft at night while he made Secret Agent, and so his mind was mainly on that. Hitchcock had given Ashcroft a memorable role as the sweet and abused crofter's wife in The 39 Steps, 1935. But Gielgud didn't take Hitchcock's movie thrillers as seriously as he did his Shakespeare, and this hurt and annoyed Hitchcock. They're not very bright, some of them, Hitchcock said of actors. Yet many actors gave their finest performances in Hitchcock pictures, and he sometimes guided them with his inattention to make them anxious. He was noted for turning his back on players doing a scene, or feigning boredom, or even falling asleep, or pretending to. But he also gave actors focused and detailed guidance when that was needed. By the time of Psycho, 1960, Hitchcock was quietly touched by how seriously Anthony Perkins took the role of Norman Bates, so much so that he allowed Perkins to reword some dialogue and make some other suggestions to deepen his characterization. Hitchcock was not a director who managed or harangued his actors as, say, Otto Preminger did. "I have a phrase for that," Hitchcock said in 1966. "I call that all the drama on the set and none on the screen." He guided by the tone of his voice and by indirection, and he wanted his actors to be like that, too. Indirect, subtle, crafty, holding something back, not hamming it up, which Hitchcock said was an actor exploding all his gunpowder. He favored major stars for his chase films because they were more likely to make the audience worry about the characters, because a star, Hitchcock said, is like one of the family. He wanted his audience to act and supply emotion to the large heads of the stars on the large screen, so he didn't want the actors to do much emoting. Hitchcock wanted the face of the actor to be ambiguous enough sometimes so that the audience could read thoughts or emotions into the face. Hitchcock is always asking us to wonder what might be real emotion on a face and what has to be supplied by the person watching that face. Hitchcock would often labor to help actors in a technical sense. He said that an actor could register an emotion better if they were already in one emotion or in the midst of some action and then caught up quickly in another emotion. It is more true to life, and it is more believable, Hitchcock said in the 1930s. What he did not want was demonstrative acting. He would stop actors and say, too much, if he needed to. Because the image is too big, Hitchcock said in the 1960s. It's enormous on the screen there, and don't forget that you've got to keep it down so you can get a range. It's like the timbre of the voice. If the voice is too high, when you want it to go high, there is nowhere to go. And it's just the same way to keep the expression to a minimum. Some critics felt in the early 1960s that Tippi Hedren was too deadpan and lacking in facial mobility, that she didn't act enough, but her work now looks subtle, natural, and very touchingly expressive when it needs to be, and only when it needs to be. To his credit, Hitchcock often defended Hedren's performances in his movies. They were the final refinement of what he looked for and wanted from people on screen. Hitchcock continually said in interviews that his ideal actor was someone who could do nothing well, and this is not either simple or easy. What Hitchcock wanted was an actor who had presence but who didn't necessarily do anything specific as an actor has to do on stage, and so, of course, this made someone like John Gielgud uncomfortable. What Hitchcock lusted for is what Louise Brooks does in Pandora's Box, 1929, and Diary of a Lost Girl, 1929, where she dances through the films unselfconsciously and transmits emotions that are always in flux in a kind of intense isolation, as Brooks herself put it. Hitchcock admired the stage actor Gerald du Maurier and said that du Maurier could do nothing on stage for 5 minutes and rivet the attention of the audience. Du Maurier made one of his rare film appearances in Lord Camber's Ladies, 1932, which Hitchcock produced but did not direct. Unprepossessing-looking, du Maurier had an incisive voice and a peremptory sort of authority, and he does indeed do nothing while his fellow performers Nigel Bruce and Gertrude Lawrence overplay their roles. And the eye always goes to him. He is a still center that commands attention. His writer-daughter Daphne provided the basis for 3 Hitchcock films. The sense of versatility in a stage actor, of convincingly being or portraying something you are not, was anathema to Hitchcock and to many of the best film directors, from Jean Renoir to Howard Hawks, which is why actor-auteurs like Bette Davis and Meryl Streep, who are always doing something and making something happen on screen, generally avoid director-auteurs who might want their presence rather than their make-believe. Streep's attempt to be a Hitchcock blonde in Still of the Night, 1982, was particularly unhappy because she always looks like she wants to be doing something more. Davis appeared on Hitchcock's TV show in 1959 as a vain, well-to-do woman who ruins the life of a young man, and her characterization is too ostentatious and self-sufficient for this context. Fear is not her thing, and she isn't neurotic in the right way. Her sensibility is so strong that it becomes a Bette Davis movie rather than a Hitchcock show, even if she gets strangled in the end. This episode was directed by Paul Henreid, her co-star in Now Voyager, 1942, and it was shot by her favored cinematographer, Ernest Haller, so Davis had her own allies here. The stage-trained Sylvia Sidney was very upset with Hitchcock's direction of her in Sabotage because she felt that she was being used as a puppet, especially in the scene where her Mrs. Verloc is impelled to stab her husband, Oskar Homolka, at the dinner table. Hitchcock complained to Francois Truffaut that it was difficult to get any shading into Sidney's face because it had a mask-like quality, but he allowed that she had nice understatement in the role. What Hitchcock wanted from his actors is finally not too far from what Robert Bresson wanted from his own mainly non-professional actor models: the mysterious and engaging workings of what can only be called soul. And Hitchcock wanted that from professional players, and he preferred to work with actors he liked several times if possible, whereas Bresson famously only wanted to use his models once. Hitchcock's films are filled to bursting with memorable performances, great performances even, understated and otherwise, and not just from leading players. And he did control and mold these performances, sometimes in a roundabout or unorthodox way. Hitchcock knew what he wanted from actors, and he nearly always got it. My hope for this book is that it will shed some light on the role of the actor in all of Hitchcock's movies, what they contribute, and what Hitchcock wants and needs from them. He didn't want palpable, didactic playing in his movies, which is why he was so exasperated by Charles Laughton in the two films they made together. What he wanted, and often what he got, was sheer being, alive and flame-like, so that seemingly limited players like Joan Barry and Janet Leigh and Tippi Hedren can often be just as moving and dynamic, and often far more so, as noted stage stars like John Gielgud, Peggy Ashcroft, Michael Redgrave, Laurence Olivier, and later method wunderkinds like Montgomery Clift. Conversely, a Hitchcock movie can utterly fall apart if cast with weak or second-rate actors. For Saboteur, 1942, Hitchcock wanted Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck for the leads, but was given Robert Cummings and Priscilla Lane instead. And they seemed to be not so much second choices as third or even fourth choice. The result was one of the weakest pictures of his first American period. More often, though, Hitchcock was very lucky in his casting, particularly when it came to his villains. The finest, or at least most vivid, performance in all of Hitchcock's work seems to me to be Robert Walker's Bruno Antony in Strangers on a Train, 1951, a man bristling with sheer, malicious, flipped-on presence. Walker had been an aw-shucks male ingenue in the 1940s, and so Bruno was a casting against type and also a revelation for him and for the audience. And the perilous excitement of this performance comes because you can feel Walker go for broke at being let off his leash, even though he's supposedly working for the most restrictive of film directors. There have been many Hitchcock books, and there will be many more because he left behind such a rich, shifting body of work that will always be open to new interpretations. This book is an investigation of the human figure in Hitchcock films, with some supplementary information and analysis of those human figures in the films they made before and after their time with the master. It is an attempt to prove that Hitchcock was a theorist of acting as much as of filmmaking, with very insightful ideas about what a human face could or could not convey, the way it could be made to lie, or the way it could be misinterpreted. That misinterpretation of the surface seems to be at the heart of Hitchcock himself as artist and man, both as his cross to bear and his increasingly shadowed hope. The French actress Brigitte Aubert, who appeared in To Catch a Thief, 1955, was pursued by Hitchcock in the mid-1950s, but had to decline his advances, though she said, "The poor cabbage had a wonderful soul, I know." Rita Riggs, who did the costumes for Psycho, told the author Stephen Rebello, "I always thought of him as the prince locked in the frog," and she spoke of his frustration with his exterior. The exterior, the surface, is all we have to go on in life. And Hitchcock wanted us to see how mistaken we could be in our judgments of that exterior. The camera lies, and the surface is also often a lie. Hitchcock taught us to distrust what we see, to question it, to break it down. That was the prerogative and the necessity of a prince locked in a frog. Chapter 1. Naughty Boys and the Pleasure Garden. Hitchcock was born Alfred Joseph Hitchcock in Leytonstone, which was part of Essex at that time, a county northeast of London, on August 13th, 1899, coming in right before the new century turned. He chose two stories to represent his infancy and childhood. In the first story, which he told Dick Cavett and many other interviewers, Hitchcock related how his mother said "boo" to him in his cradle, and so this supposedly put a scare into him for life. Hitchcock's mother was the daughter of a policeman. In the second story, which he told far more often, a very young Hitchcock was sent to a police station by his father with a note telling the police to lock him up in a cell for 5 minutes with the admonishment, "This is what we do to naughty boys." It was a tale that Hitchcock stuck to all his life. And when he was asked what he would like printed on his tombstone, he replied, "This is what we do to naughty boys." He hated feeling confined, and as an adult, he loved to travel. His father, William, and mother, Emma, were both half English and half Irish. William was a greengrocer, and Emma had borne 2 other children, William, who was born in 1890, and Ellen Kathleen, born in 1892, before she had her third and last child, Alfred. He was close to his mother, but his weight isolated him from other children. Perhaps, though, he partly welcomed this isolation, at least as a defense mechanism. He loved to study train timetables and to figure out just when certain trains were departing and arriving. According to biographer Patrick McGilligan, the Hitchcock family was a lively and friendly one, and full of fun and jokes. Donald Spotto paints a grimmer picture in his Notorious biography, The Dark Side of Genius. But Spotto always suspiciously twists things for a negative slant in that book, and some of his negative stories have been challenged and even proven false by McGilligan. Hitchcock was brought up in the Roman Catholic faith and sent to be educated by the Jesuits at St. Ignatius College in Stamford Hill, London. He stayed off to the side mainly, watching others and observing, feeling superior when he could and lonely when he had to be. Hitchcock disliked and feared the authority of the Jesuits, just as he disliked and feared policemen or any authority figure. He didn't like being afraid of such figures, but he did like reading Edgar Allan Poe and getting all wrought up with fear and reassuring himself that he was actually safe in the comfort of home. What Hitchcock abhorred most was complacency. He wanted to be jolted, and to jolt others out of that truly dangerous state. Already Hitchcock loved food, best of all, as a comfort. He remembered once waking up in the night as a boy of 5 or 6 and realizing his parents had gone out for a walk in Hyde Park, leaving him alone. Afraid and insecure, nothing but night all around me, the young Hitchcock went and found himself a piece of cold meat to eat, and as he ate the piece of meat, he dried his tears. He had a lifelong aversion to eggs, and as a boy at St. Ignatius, he once threw some eggs at the priest's windows, a supercharged image or incident that might have thrilled his most avid supporter, François Truffaut. When he was 15, Hitchcock's father died, and so Hitchcock drew closer to his mother. He was already reading cinema trade papers from America and from Britain at this age, and was studying engineering when he was excused from any active military service in World War I. In 1919, Hitchcock had a story called Gas, published for the in-house magazine of a company called Henley's, where he worked for several years as a draftsman and was popular with the other workers, often making them laugh.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?